What is up everyone, and welcome back to another video. So as you probably know by now, dying off spawn is one of the most common issues the players face in Fortnite. Maybe you're struggling to get a weapon and you die with no loot, maybe you always run out of materials and you lose early game fights, or maybe you're simply getting worse loot than your opponents and getting outplayed. Whatever the issue may be, this video is meant to give you everything you'll need to know in order to win off spawn every single game in Fortnite Chapter 3. Before we get into it though, be sure to drop a like if this video helps you out, and subscribe if you're new and want to see more. And if you want to help your boy out a bit extra, then consider using code Teckoh in the Fortnite item shop. It's 100% free for you and I really do appreciate it a ton. But with that said and without further ado, let's hop right into today's video. So starting off today's video, we're going to begin with the most obvious tip, which is where to actually land, aka your drop spot. Even if you're a great player overall, if you landed a spot that doesn't fit your playstyle, you're going to struggle quite a bit no matter what, so it's really important that we get this sorted nice and early. Now of course, picking out a drop spot doesn't mean you have to land there every single game, and I do recommend actually having multiple spots you're comfortable with just in case you want to mix it up a bit. But having that one solid spot that you know in and out is absolutely a good idea, especially if you're trying to grind arena points or win more games overall. So when it comes to your drop spot, there are a few factors you're going to want to keep in mind. These include loot, population, mobility, and position. As you might expect, loot is a pretty simple one. Obviously your spot needs to have enough loot to support you and your teammates if you're choosing a drop spot for a team mode. Typically around 10 chests for a solo player is considered very solid, and a little bit more than that is even better. Moving on to population, and this is also pretty simple. Your spot should have a population that suits your playstyle. So obviously you don't want to land somewhere super populated if you're a passive player, just like you don't want to land somewhere super silent if you're a hardcore W keyer. Typically having 2 to 3 players or 1 to 2 teams in your drop spot is ideal, as it allows you to get those early game kills without an absurdly high risk. Obviously the more players around, the higher chance of third parties and things like that. Moving on to mobility, and this is another factor that's really important. Having things like cars, spider webs, rifts, boats, and other stuff can really be helpful when it comes to getting around the map fast. Even if you're not a hardcore W keyer, having tons of mobility is super helpful regardless, since it allows you to rotate faster and get wherever you need to go. And finally, position basically just refers to wherever you're situated on the map. Typically if you're a more passive player, you're going to want to opt for an edge map location since it's further away from the center where most people are rotating. And if you want tons of kills, then being somewhat near the center of the map is going to be really good. Obviously you don't want to be just hovering around the outskirts. It's not a set in stone requirement, but it definitely does help a lot. So with that said guys, those are all some considerations that you're going to want to make when you're choosing a drop spot. Obviously I can't sit here and recommend you all a drop spot since I don't know your exact situation, but hopefully this serves as a solid guide to give you some idea as to where you might want to go. So assuming you have a drop spot figured out, the next key to winning off spawn is preparing for fights. In order to prepare for fights properly, it's really important to get loot, materials, and HP right away, and that's the ultimate goal when you first land. You want to get kitted as fast as possible and clear out the rest of your POI. So what I recommend you do is head to the website fortnite.gg and take a look around your POI, see all the chest locations, and figure out where you're best landing at. The key here though is to balance out your options. The area with the most chests isn't always the best, since other things like slurp trucks and barrels, food crates, or the actual location within the POI can all impact how good an area is. Try to figure out which area in your POI has the best mix of materials, loot, and other items, and choose that to be your drop area rather than only focusing on one factor. And from there, once you know which area within your POI you're going to land at, you're going to want to simply practice it over and over again, whether that's in pubs, arena, or something else. Figure out the most efficient way to loot your area, the best things to farm for materials, and really just get a good feel for it. That way it comes naturally when you're landing there in a serious game. If you do follow these directions correctly, you should be landing at an area with good loot, good materials, and you should be getting good shield every game as well, setting you up for an amazing early game every single time you queue up. Ideally, you're going to want to have a solid loadout, some good materials, and a bunch of shield before you even begin to push a fight. Of course, you're probably going to be forced to fight once in a while before getting all this stuff, which is perfectly fine, but that's what I recommend you focus on in order to minimize RNG when you do get into fights. Another super quick tip when it comes to the pre-fighting part of early game is when you're gliding in, always try to look around and analyze where people are landing. So many players simply tunnel vision on the part where they're landing, and they get surprised when someone comes at them from the next building over. Knowing what's actually going on around you is absolutely crucial in early game, and it's going to allow you to better plan for where and how you're going to move. It's such a simple tip, but it really does help a lot once you start doing it. So once you found a drop spot and figured out somewhat of a loot route to follow, the next step is going to be the actual fighting part. Now the earliest fight you can have is someone 50-50ing you for your building or area, like landing straight on your head basically, and those fights are really just going to come down to landing on a chest or floor loot spawn and being able to navigate your area to outplay your opponent, which mostly just comes down to pure practice. Obviously having solid knowledge of your drop area is very important, and being able to play around the structures and natural angles is super helpful when it comes to those super early fights. But assuming you survived your drop, you got kitted up, and you're ready to fight, I'm going to go through a few quick tips that I found really helpful in terms of early game fights. So my first tip for early game fights is that even though using the strategies in this video video is going to help you quite a bit when it comes to getting materials. You also do want to be fairly resourceful in early game fights. That means that instead of cranking up like a maniac and trying to build fight everyone, you're going to want to stay lower toward the ground and focus more on holding right hand peaks and getting smart angles against your opponent. The issue I see so many players having in early game is that they think they need to outbuild their opponent in every single fight, when usually it's the person who gets the smartest angles and peaks who wins early game engagements. And that's one of the biggest things that I notice that separates pro players from the average player, is that the average player thinks that they need to build up a ton and the pro player just goes for good angles and smart peaks. Frankly, unless you're in a shambles situation or you're hit for a ton of damage, then you shouldn't really run out of materials during early game fights. But of course, the goal is to have plenty just in case. But overall, just try to be resourceful with your materials in early game fights. You don't have to absolutely like refrain from building, but you also don't want to just spam build for no reason. My next tip for early game fights is a crucial one as well, and that's going to relate to positioning. In early game, you never want to get caught with your pants down in between multiple people, which is why you're usually going to want to fight closer to the edge of the POI. Now, obviously, this tip mainly applies if you have more than one person at your drop spot, but I can't tell you guys how often someone's going to be near the middle of a POI, start fighting, and then get third-partied by 2 extra people and wonder why. Being at the center of your POI basically means that all eyes are pointed towards you, so when possible, try to position yourself away from the center of your POI if you have multiple people with you. And of course, another aspect of positioning is high ground, and most of us know by now that positioning yourself on something high like a building is a great position to get tags and find an appropriate fight. On to the next tip though, and this is a super simple one real quick, and that's to look for third-party opportunities in early game. When you're in early game, usually when 2 people fight, the winner ends up being on low HP and materials, simply because most people begin early game fights in shambles. If you hear shots popping off and there aren't already players around you, it's definitely worth going for the third party and cleaning up real quick. Honestly guys, cleaning up fights is such a simple and easy way to get kills, especially in early game when people are pretty much in shambles pretty much every time you see them fighting. So definitely keep your eye out for those third party opportunities in early game. And my final tip for early game fights guys is a super simple one, and that's just to play patient. Easily one of the biggest killers in early game fights is when you're fighting someone and you just want to get it out of the way, so you make a crazy play and end up getting killed. Slow and smart is the way to play in early game, and that includes all sorts of factors like positioning, fight selection, and angles and peaks. Especially when you're mid-fight, the player who usually wins the intense early game fights is the one who plays slow, looks for angles and smart plays, and capitalizes on their opponent's mistakes once they get a bit too antsy. Basically, if you're more patient than your opponent, you're at a huge advantage. So overall guys, when you're fighting in early game, unless you urgently need to end the fight like the storm is coming, just play it slow and smart and take advantage once your opponent messes up. But with all that said guys, that's gonna wrap it up for today's video on how to win off spawn every single game in Fortnite Chapter 3. Overall, if you utilize the tips in this video, you should be able to play more consistent and survive off spawn while also getting a respectable amount of kills. If this video did help you out, then be sure to drop a like on it and consider subscribing as well if you want to see more content just like this in the future. And as well as that, if you want to help your boy out a bit extra, then consider using code Teckoh in the Fortnite item shop, as it's 100% free and it really does help me out a bunch. As always, a massive thank you to everyone who's using my code. It really does mean a ton. With that said though, thank you all for watching this video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.